brings us to the next panel, which is sustainability and decision making. And to do this, we're joined by former prime ministers from 4 countries, Canada, Greece, Mali and Bhutan. Political time, I think, is a new dimension that we can throw into the mix. It usually means yesterday, and the urgency with which our leaders are expected to deliver and the time or the terms in which they're often given to deliver can be problematic. But I think having people who've served as prime ministers, who've led countries, who've now had some time to reflect, I think there's a very interesting lesson or lessons hopefully to be learned. The session's going to be moderated by Eleni Giokos, who is a distinguished journalist, CNN anchor and correspondent, a South African of Greek heritage. Eleni, please bring your panel to the stage. Thank you very much.
There we go. Very good afternoon. Please take a seat. Round of applause, everyone, for my fantastic guests. I'll be introducing you to them in just a moment. A warm welcome to the former Canadian Prime Minister, Kim Campbell. Welcome to the former Mali Prime Minister, Moussa Mara. George Papandreou, former Prime Minister of Greece, and Jigme Thinley, former Prime Minister of Bhutan. What a fantastic array of former leaders. You can share with us all your lessons, mistakes, and of course, with the passage of time, what that ultimately means, the impact that you've had on society looking back. One of the things that we've been focusing here at the Culture Summit, which is very important, is sort of the parallels that we draw between planet, people, and of course, what we've been focusing on in terms of crises, and how that all plays a very big role on how it impacts culture at the end of the day. It impacts the way we think, the way we feel, the way we respond. And the people in this room react to this, of course, quite strongly in their respective fields. So we're very delighted to have you with us today. Prime Minister Campbell, I want to start off with you. I want to go back in time, since we're honoring the notion of time during this summit. In 1993, the world was a really interesting place. NAFTA was signed, right? So this is a trade agreement that started, I guess, an important journey of globalization. You were the first female prime minister in Canada. We actually met someone behind, in the backstage, saying they remember when you were, put in place and what that meant to her. It was the end of the Cold War. I'm just looking at generally what the state of play was in Canada, and you saw unemployment, recessionary environments, and you had an important mandate. So looking back at that time, what do you think about most in terms of some of the toughest decisions you needed to take?
Well, I had to take tough decisions in the context of an election campaign because I had to call an election right away. And, there is no universally popular decision. I had to make some decisions, actually, with respect to military procurement. But I think one of the interesting challenges was that I was succeeding a prime minister who was an Anglophone from Quebec.
Yeah.
And in Canada, the language culture is a very significant part of our society. And so there I was, an Anglophone, trying to unite a country of 2 official languages and enormous distances. And I think that was I'm not sure that there was a crisis decision I had to make, but every day I had to think about how would the things that I was going to say be received in these 2 different communities. And I would say to the cultural community here that one of the things that we face in Canada, and the Club of Madrid, we have a shared societies project which is designed to help countries that have minorities, and 90% of the countries in the world have minorities of more than 10%. But in Canada, we have very vibrant cultural communities, but they often are only for one language. So we have in French Canada incredible music and theater and singers, and in English Canada the same. But they don't necessarily, maybe except for Celine Dion or somebody like that, or a few of our stars who've become not just national but global. But culture can do a great deal. And so when I was campaigning, the cultural people who were involved in my events, etc., were a very important part of the message that I was trying to communicate, that although I was now an Anglophone, I spoke French, but that I was now a new Anglophone prime minister, that my priority was to unite the whole of the country. And I think that was hard. That was because I was different from my predecessor, who had grown up fluently bilingual and very comfortable in French Canada. So I'm not sure if it was a crisis, is more of kind of if crises can be ongoing issues that you have to deal with, and they present little crises every day that you have to face.
There was a referendum on Quebec at the time as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was a really interesting moment. Prime Minister Mara, great to have you with us.
Thank you.
You know, I mean, Mali has an interesting history. The whole continent of Africa has an interesting history, a complex one, a turbulent one. When you came into power in 2014 as Prime Minister, 2012 coup had occurred 2 years prior. I'm looking at Mali now, right? A coup just recently in 2021, still elections that's still to happen. And here's the reality. You've always spoken about youth unemployment. You've always spoken about the threat of terrorism in the Sahel and how that does intrinsically impact Malian culture in many different ways. And it's tied to sort of what we see in the economy as well. How would you define some of the big decisions you needed to take to unite Mali post-coup?
And you are right to say that the context of our countries is complex and difficult. Sahelian region, this is the western part of Africa, composed by some countries with a young people. The average age in our country is 17. More than 80% are below 40. In this context, the main thing to retain is unemployment for youth and for young, and the huge diversity of the countries. If I take the example of Mali, we have more than 12 different communities with a very poor people, and trying to get all of them together. This is a main issue in this country. And Mali face also to rebellions for some communities in the northern part of the country. And culture is, for me, the main way to prioritize in order to bring people together. Because before colonization and before the coming of France and the other countries, colonizers, all of these people lived together safely, and we had a huge empires on these areas. We need to try to get this target again, and culture is the way to use. And we are trying to do so. When I was Prime Minister, we prioritized some cultural activities, festivals, and making people living together in one region and organize across the country different festivals, northern part, southern part. And culture is the key.
You know, as you're speaking, it reminds me of the story of Mansa Musa.
Mm-hmm. For
yeah,
sure, for
Mansa
sure.
Musa. Do you guys know who Mansa Musa is?
Who is known as the richest man of the history.
Yes, an incredible king, and then he took control of the gold trade. It was an incredible story, and it speaks to that before colonization.
He did a pilgrimage.
Yes.
And he brought a lot of gold with him, and he was known as a very, 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 very rich man. And he came from the area where Mali is and Guinea and the other countries. And this history make all of us very proud of our history. And the culture is the heritage of that. That's why is the way we need to use in order to make all of us differently very happy to stay on the same country. And our countries also are very young,
Yeah.
because less than 60 years, and the borders are artificial. And we have some differences between us inside the country. And we need to strengthen cultural ways to help cultural actors and to settle a real cultural sector in order to contribute to national unity.
So I do encourage everyone in the audience that hasn't read about Mansa Musa, please do yourself a favor and read this incredible story. Prime Minister Papandreou, always good to speak to you. You know, I was thinking about your journey and what a life you've had in sort of the political realm in Greece. You were thrust into a perfect storm in 2009. So get this, the country's deficit, Greece's deficit, was way more than it had been reported. Suddenly you find yourself on the negotiating table with the Troika to try and figure out what to do. And you had to make tough decisions. In fact, frankly, let's be honest, you had to break promises that you'd initially made. Because you had no choice, basically. But what would you do differently, looking back now, with the benefit of hindsight?
Well, let me begin by, Eleni, thank you for the question. When I was 14, I had a machine gun put to my head when the dictatorship took over and they were arresting my father.
Yeah.
So when I became prime minister and we had to deal with this debt crisis, and it was a global crisis, but we were focusing on Greece because of the particular crisis, and we had our responsibility for it. I remember a meeting in the European Union where we were making a decision to help Greece to sort of calm the markets, and it was 10 minutes to 2 in the morning. And somebody shouted and said, we only have 10 minutes to make the final decision because the markets are opening in Japan in 10 minutes, and if we haven't made a decision, there'll be chaos around the world. So this is the type of pressure we were under. So I almost felt I had another gun at my head at that time. So I would see what I understood is from this experience is the complexity of our world. People were talking about banks too big to fail. Actually, I think we have a system too big to control, and people feel a sense of powerlessness, also inequality. And if we are going to move to a transition to a sustainable environment and society, we have to really think of a just society, a good society. Prime Minister Thinley here from Bhutan is talking about the happiness index, but even from the ancient Greece, the idea of a good and just society was basic with Aristotle and Plato and some of the philosophers. We also have to bring in people, and this is, I think, where I wanted to do this, but of course with the Troika on top, they basically took away your power, your democratic power. How do we get people to be really engaged? And this, I think, is where culture also can play a role. We need to find institutions in our society so that people own the problem and own the solutions at the same time, and take on, not only learn about the problem of climate change, but be part of the solution of how we're going to change these. And then that means also that it's a whole mindset, a different mindset of leadership, a different mindset, a cultural change in leadership, in opening up rather than saying, I've got the solution. You know, I hear the Troika, whoever, I'm going to impose it. No, we need to work, have society come in, and with innovation, with ideas, and culture can truly play that role if it wants to be the art scene and not only to be educating, but also help in this participatory process. So I think we need to see, and that also goes back to an ancient time, even though it was not ideal in ancient Greece. Women and were not allowed, they were slaves, but the idea of participation was also education, culture, theater, philosophy, music, sport. That was creating a good citizen who knew how to take right decisions.
Thank you for sharing that with us, and thank you for also sharing the story of your experience when you were 14 years old. It must have been absolutely traumatizing at the time, but it's interesting that, you know, fast forward, you felt like you had no choice, right? You had a machine gun at your head. You basically are saying you had no choice but to take these tough decisions, yeah?
And I think this is what a lot of people feel around the world, where we're seeing this demagoguery, because there is a sense of alienation, there's a sense of things are happening, things are changing, insecurity, And some politicians are playing, and this is why I say we need a different culture of politics. Some politicians are using this just fear-mongering, finding a scapegoat, somebody's to blame, somebody else. That creates divisions, polarization. While I think we need a culture of where the politician is more, or the leaders are more educators and learners, but creating a safe space for people to voice their ideas, to voice their proposals, to actually have different views and come up with ideas and solutions. And that's a very different type of a leadership role. And I think this is where culture, because culture in many ways, okay, it sensitizes, it can sensitize, it can create threads of bringing people together, it can divide people also, but the best of it, I think, is bringing people together in this global world. But it can also open up the box to think differently.
Absolutely.
In a different world.
It absolutely can. Prime Minister Finlay, great to have you with us. The happiest man on this panel. Yes? I think there's consensus on that. What a wonderful story Bhutan has, and your story, being the first democratically elected Prime Minister in 2008. Perhaps you're listening to what Prime Minister Papandreou was saying about this crisis, which, you basically become Prime Minister at the time when the world is falling apart, and you come in with a very different agenda, right? You're focusing on heritage, you're focusing on sort of the environmental priorities that are required. And of course, Bhutan is leaps and bounds ahead in terms of happiness, because there's the gross national happiness, which was put in place in Bhutan in 1972. The UN General Assembly only really caught on in 2011. But you guys have done so many incredible things from an environmental perspective, on a happiness perspective. So I wonder, when you came in, knowing the world was falling apart from an economic perspective, what did you choose to prioritize as sort of the first decision that you had to make coming into power?
Well, thank you very much. I don't know whether I'm the happiest person, but I will say I am happy. As indeed, most of the people in my country are too. What did I choose to do, given the status of the world at the time that I came? Led the government. Well, the king of Bhutan had set a precedent, had established the basis on which Bhutan should grow and develop, and that was to grow and develop materially, spiritually, socially, in harmony with nature. And for me, as a Prime Minister, that wasn't difficult to do. And having anticipated your question, in fact, since you very kindly gave me a hint of what you're going to ask, I've written some notes down. Why it was easy for me, why it wasn't difficult for me, is because the Bhutanese society is grounded in the ethics of realizing perfection of the true nature of mind in our increasingly imperfect world. This is to be pursued through right thought, right speech, and right action. Culture, for us, is essentially a dynamic complex of tools to this end. It is the stuff of values, traditions, institutions, practices, and their tangible and intangible expressions. The primary purpose of each of these is to improve and refine our senses, our perceptions, behavior, and skills, to make ourselves better human beings, to inspire will and capacity to pursue and enhance peace, prosperity, and well-being within an enabling natural environment. In other words, culture is the means to personal and societal perfection, to be manifest in meaningful life and happiness. Since the beginning of our national development process, our policies and endeavors have been guided by this vision for holistic, inclusive, sustainable development. Furthermore, our traditional wisdom grounds our way of life in the truth of interdependence. This helps us to stay mindful of the reality of all life being interconnected and interdependent. Yeah. It gives us the humility to accept and appreciate that humans are just one part of a complete complex web of life that we are not, that the planet is not organized in a way, in a food chain structure with humans at the top. For the Bhutanese, even the inanimate forms of nature, such as mountains, rivers, streams, ponds, rocks, trees, and flowers, have the right to exist and flourish. They must be respected. Science now establishes that the well-being of all nature, including our own, is inseparable, inextricably connected, that we exist because of each other. So, where culture and nature are not seen as separate but mutually dependent, there can be few challenges, as indeed was my experience. I faced very few obstacles in my time, not only as Minister of Culture, but as a development agent in my early years, and later as the chair of the National Environment Commission. Our Constitution now empowers every citizen as a guardian of our natural environment. And we are on our way to becoming an organic brand, while our commitment to high-value, low-volume tourism has found favor with several countries. From a forest cover of a little more than 60% in the 60s, we now have 70% forest cover. And entire country is connected through biological corridors to ensure the conservation, preservation, and the survival of this amazing biodiversity that we have in the country. And you may be interested to know that we have even preserved the sanctity of our high mountain peaks. They remain unclimbed. Such features of Mother Nature, the source and sustenance of all life, is not to be conquered, but to be respected and sanctified. The current generation of leaders are, however, facing increasing challenges. This, of course, arises from the need to balance growing population needs with our fragile mountain ecosystems. Whether they can overcome these challenges will depend on the collective will of the people and its leaders to remain faithful to our search for perfection through our unique development paradigm of gross national happiness, which promotes inclusive, holistic, and sustainable development.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Prime Minister. I was really thinking about gross national happiness and versus GDP and the metrics, that we're so used to, and the realities that we face, for example, in South Africa, where I was raised, and inequalities. And I referred to what Aristotle had written about, that you need to be happy, you need to have your material needs met, right? But the mindless pursuit of wealth isn't really the way to go. But also poverty means a huge deficit, and that doesn't mean that you get to flourish. So because you had to deal with this economic crisis, as did Prime Minister Papandreou, as well as Prime Minister Mara had to deal with, what is your view on gross national happiness and how to bring about happiness and how that impacts culture? Because, by the way, anything to do with the economy, it impacts culture. It impacts absolutely anything.
Well, I think happiness is kind of a short-form term for everything coming together in an optimal way for people. If you think of the American Declaration of Independence, it talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we don't say that in Canada. We say peace, order, and good government, but that's just because we're perhaps less ambitious. But I think even when I hear about your preservation of mountain peaks, when you hear the stories of how polluted Mount Everest has become because too many people have come there and they're dumping their garbage, you think of the idea of seeing mountain peaks as being kept pristine for future generations, for everyone. But one of the reasons why you don't have as much happiness is it's not also was always easy for politicians to make the kind of decisions they would like. And I wanted just to say two things that have arisen out of our discussion, because we're talking about culture and we're talking about time in this seminar. One of the interesting things about the cultural industries is that you create works that can often command sustained attention. We hear now that the typical voice clip or quotation of somebody who's trying to make a serious speech is maybe 1 column inch or 10 seconds. And I think politicians find it very difficult sometimes to get complex ideas across. But if you go to a movie or you go to a play, people will sit quietly for almost 2 hours or even more. And so you in the culture industry have opportunities often to command people's attention, to develop complex stories and ideas, often that have very powerful messages that can also help to create the stage, what I would call the constituency for good policy. People come to understand. And I think that, you know, the unit of human understanding is the story. And all politicians try and tell stories. We try to have a narrative to try and explain what problems are, what it is that we're doing. But very often we are constrained in how we can tell that narrative. And so we need partners, or maybe even adversaries, to make sure that our narrative is true and right and
So
fair.
what's the line between sort of propaganda and narrative and truth-telling?
Exactly. And so I think that people who are in cultural industries, and incidentally, culture means not just the arts and high culture. We have, as we talked about in democracies, a culture, you know, if we have a democratic culture, kids in school will have an election or will vote to choose, you know, who's going to do some job or what activity they're going to do. It's a kind of a natural reflex that they think everyone should get a chance to have a say. That's part of a democratic culture. And these things can be reflected in works of art. You know, I didn't mention at the beginning of that crisis that I was the first woman Prime Minister of Canada. And I guess maybe I didn't like to see it as a crisis, more as a challenge. But what I found was that when people are not, nobody who looked or sounded like me had ever done that job before. And for a lot of people, that was hard, particularly people in the journalism field who were used to, you know, covering people who talk like this. And I wasn't like that. So the stories that you tell, the people who are in them, the way you tell them, have a great deal to do with creating a culture of expectation in a society of who gets to do that job. Here is Eleni Jacobs. I can remember a time when women weren't allowed to read the news because people said, well, who will ever trust them? What do they know? And now CNN is just full of all these amazing women journalists and newsreaders who, you know, to me, you know, if I see a
Like
man, I
Eleni.
go, oh, that's odd, there's a man there. So I think the partnership and the relationship between those that we call the participants in our cultural industry who help to explain our values and articulate our values in ways that are congenial. I just want to end by one point. Steven Pinker wrote a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he argues that notwithstanding how terrible we think the world is, it's actually a lot less violent than it was centuries before. And he said one of the factors that he thinks helped to contribute to a gradual reduction in violence and humanization of people was the invention of the novel. And incidentally, the first novel that we know of that was written by a woman, so I just throw that out there. But because he said, when people began to read novels, as opposed to books of philosophy or whatever, but they began to read novels, they began to have empathy they identified with characters. And it was part of an education in creating empathy. You know, when you think of how many books that you've read, stories you read as a kid where you cried at the end because, you know, somebody died or whatever. So who we are as people is so much a reflection of the culture that we're exposed to, both the values of the institutions of our society, but what our artists and our presenters are creating for us, and how we develop our own human capacities and identities. And as politicians, we want a culture that supports good decision making and that gives a constituency for wise policy, not for greed or divisive policies.
Yeah, I know. Brilliant. It's so fascinating to hear you speak about all of these, you know, elements that impact culture and the intersection, I guess, of politics and culture.
Could I add
Yes,
something
please.
to what Prime Minister Campbell said, what Kim said? When I was first elected, because these are stereotypes that sometimes people have around power in politics.
Yeah.
I was first elected, and this was just after the dictatorship, so people were fighting against it. They wanted democracy. But when I was elected, I went back to my constituency, and they said, now you've got to buy a black Mercedes, now you've got to hit your fist on the desk, you have to show you're powerful. And I said, wasn't that what the dictators were? I mean, are we going to be like them? So, and I said, at some point I said, well, if I have to be like that, maybe I just go to a Greek island and play guitar and just, but I said, I'm going to be myself and be much different. But we had to break down that stereotype. And I think literature and so on can break down stereotypes. It can make people think differently. So if you go back to the Iliad, for example, which is a horrific war, 10 years of fighting over a woman, but with rape, with killing, with blood, and so on, is actually considered the first anti-war story. Over the years of generations, some of the Greeks started saying, hey, this is not the way to solve problems. Maybe we should do it through debate and democracy. Maybe we should do the Olympic Games, which was not just sport, it was culture too, where we celebrate excellence, we celebrate the best in human beings rather than the arenas where we kill each other for no reason. And I think this is where art and music and novels and sport can really play a role in changing the stereotypes of power, the hubris that we sometimes have in power. And I think this is what we're seeing today. Too much hubris in people who have power, who think, and they use that power to polarize, to keep hold of this thing we call a chair.
Yeah. Very important comments, specifically about, you know, conflict right now that's plaguing me, I think plaguing a lot of people in this room. There's just so much going on. Images very difficult to turn away from and not think deeply about. Images that are going to affect us culturally for a long time. We're going to ask questions. We're going to look back and say, how have we dealt with certain issues playing out in the world? And to your point, Prime Minister Papandreou, talking about this isn't the way to solve problems. We should sit, there should be dialogue, we should be thinking about life differently. So here's my question in terms of whether we are chipping away at our morals and ethics and our humanity, and whether international institutions are failing us right now, specifically with what we're seeing in the region, and whether you're worried about this and where we're headed and how that's going to impact culture, for example.
I would like to remind some little things. I started by saying culture is important to bring people together and to show them how they are sharing the same story, they are living in the same area, and they have the same life. We do not forget, as long as the lack of food, the lack of education, the lack of job, the lack of energy, electricity will prevail. It will be difficult to talk about culture, and it will be difficult to bring people together. The reality is in some of our countries, not only in Africa, but around the world, is people are struggling daily to get food, to get money to feed family, and to educate their children. Don't forget it. And the leader, as myself, our main issue in our country is that we are aware of how culture is important. We are aware of how international cooperation, regional cooperation is important. International institutions are important, but we are struggling daily for that. I would like to put the light on it. And coming back to the culture, my country, precisely, is a huge cultural country. We talk about history, we talk about Mansa Musa, we talk about the empires. And I am really convinced that culture could be the base even of industries. We talk about industrial culture or culture of industries. We need to strengthen it, and we need to prioritize it. And inside the country and between countries. That could maybe help international organizations, as what you were saying, to be more strong, to be maybe more open to others, and to contribute to solve the problem they are committed to do so. And this is my opinion about culture. We need to put the priority on that, but don't forget the basis for human. If we have a lot of countries, the basis for human are not yet present.
And thank you for that. So speaking to this gross national happiness metric, right? Yes. I want to be realistic.
Yes. When I heard the Prime Minister saying of I am happy and happiness, this is the goal, this is the target. But it is difficult to talk about happiness So someone we are angry. It is
Exactly.
very difficult to
Absolutely.
do so. And it is a target. We have to get enough means to make people feed, educated, and getting job. And then maybe we could starting to talk about happiness.
That's very true. I want to pivot to climate change. I think it's very important to talk about sustainability and what that means down the line. Bhutan is a great example. Net zero, one of the only countries that have achieved net zero.
Well, we are beyond that.
Beyond, so you're
know,
negative, right?
In the year that I became Prime Minister, one of the first things I did was to declare or pledge at the COP15 in 1998 that Bhutan will not only remain carbon neutral, but carbon negative for all times. So we have achieved net zero and beyond. We are a net sequestration, 0.4
Yeah,
other countries
a carbon basin,
beyond our
right?
own, yes.
Yeah. But, so what kind of tough policies do you need to put in place? Was it tough for you to be able to achieve that? Is it something that's scalable for other countries?
Well, here, culture has an important role to play.
Yeah.
Leaders in the cultural industry, creative industry, have a major role to play in influencing the thinking, the minds, and the culture of the people. The point is that we have lost our humanity, our sense of human being. We have lost our sense of desire for what is really good for us, what it is that we need. We have allowed ourselves to be controlled by greed. And that is what is wrong with the world today. That is why we are going wrong. And that is why we are in the process of, in fact, if you let me, I will, in my appeal to the majority of the people here who I think are, in fact, members of the cultural industry, leaders in the cultural and creative industry, this is what I would say to them. To those in the creative and cultural industry, I say, do not despair, despite what the situation is now. It's hopeless. It seems hopeless. But you are powerful. You have a role to play. You can make a difference. You, more than most others, can see that pure greed has become the primary reason for all our striving at any cost. We have become suicidal in our struggles to have what we do not need. Your keen eyes can see that we are dying. Morally, spiritually, socially, culturally, and indeed physically. I appeal to you, the writers, poets, artists, craftsfolk, and architects, musicians, singers and dancers, weavers and filmmakers, and so on, to dream again. Be courageous and give us hope. Stimulate our numbed senses and wake us up from our sleepwalking to the precipice of doom. Arouse our aesthetic senses, find our values and the goodness that is there inherent in all of us. Let your audiences see beauty. Unleash your creative power and wrest back from the market forces your rightful avant-garde role in transforming and advancing civilization. We are going through a process of decivilization.
Yeah.
In halting climate change. To this end, let there be patronage by government, businesses, and ordinary citizens so that you are not compromised by your failure to make ends meet. Whereas the reach of your work and messages were limited by access to time, by access and time, you now had the advantage of purveying your work and your messages globally and instantaneously through technology that has overcome both space and time.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister.
Here, here.
You have the power in this room, overriding message. Prime Minister Campbell, we don't know what's going to happen with the US elections later on this year. And the reason I raise this is because, the last time we saw Donald Trump taking on leadership, he really walked back a lot on the climate agenda protocols, right? Specifically Paris agreements and so forth. How important is the leadership of the West in terms of us achieving our global climate goals? And this path of sustainability, which, by the way, we're running out of time. We're in an emergency. That, we have to act in unison to be able to tackle this existential threat.
Well, I think we've had some extraordinary leadership in Europe. We've had leadership in countries around the world. But I think most people recognize that the United States, first of all, is the largest emitter, the largest economy, that its absence from a struggle greatly weakens it, that it's a problem. But let me just say that there were a couple of instances where Canada was involved in showing leadership that actually got some results from the United States. In fact, my predecessor as Prime Minister just died, and we've been talking about the time when he was leading the government and I was one of his ministers. And one of the things we were able to do was to create the Acid Rain Treaty. One of my colleagues in Parliament, and there was a very good example of how a member of Parliament who wasn't in the government was very concerned about the effect of acid rain on the forests in his region in Ontario. And he kept nagging to the Prime Minister, you have to do something. And finally, the Prime Minister looked into it and realized it was a big issue. And Prime Minister Mulroney had actually created a very good friendship with President Reagan. Now, acid rain raised a lot of the same issues that climate change does, because there were a lot of industries that were putting out acid from their smokestacks that were destroying the forest, who kept saying, well, no, it's too expensive, we can't change it, this is a negative thing. So it required governments to go, to create regulations and to take head on very highly financed economic interests. But in fact, we created the Acid Rain Treaty, and a lot of it came out of the quality of the science, the very good relationship between the Canadian Prime Minister and the American President, and a growing public understanding of how the geography that they loved was being ruined through acid rain. And so that treaty was passed. So that's a good sign. In the same way, the Montreal Protocol, where we outlawed the use of chlorofluorocarbons in and we all had our hairspray. Sprays were the greatest thing ever, where you were spraying under your arms, you were spraying your head, you were spraying your windows, and then somebody said, whoops, you can't do that because you're making a big hole in the ozone layer. So, whoops, back to the drawing board. But again, that protocol, which involved a lot of industry saying, we can't change it. If we can't do the spray, what'll we do? Well, you go to the store now and you have a little hand spray that doesn't require any gases, or they have gases that supposedly don't kill the ozone layer. What I'm saying is that there were microcosms of the huge issue, which is climate change, that involved governments having to use good science and having public support to change policies to protect the environment against a lot of well-funded, very powerful opposition. So I think, sometimes people are slow to get the point. Sometimes they're slow to see the reality. But when we see the negative effects of things that we're doing, we have to be grown-ups. For example, I'm also from a country, not only are we big emitters, we're big asbestos miners. Any of you know about asbestos? Wonderful thing. When I was a little kid, there were theaters where children were killed because there was a fire. And people said, oh, this is terrible, and then asbestos came along, and you could have a big asbestos curtain so that if there was a fire in the theater, it could come down and protect the audience. But turns out the problem is that asbestos gets in your lungs and kills you and the people who mine it. So you have to say, well, we didn't mean to hurt people. It wasn't our goal to hurt people. We thought we had this wonderful product that could save lives, but we know now that it's much more dangerous than any benefit we get from it. So as grown-ups, we have to say, okay, how do we deal with that, and how do we move forward, recognizing that what we thought was good is not good, and we need new and different ways of doing things. So
absolutely.
But there are successes. There are examples of where we've done that, and so don't give up, folks. Keep writing those stories.
Yeah, exactly. Prime Minister Mara, this is a conversation that I'm very passionate about in terms of the industrialization of the African continent. Africa only accounts for like 5% of global greenhouse gases. And there's this sort of tug of war of like, what is going to happen to the African continent? And you very, eloquently explained why industrialization is a must. It's not an if or a but, right? Industrialization needs to happen on the African continent. But how do you square that up with this emerging culture of we all need to be on the same boat when it comes to climate change, and how do we do it better?
Talking about the climate change, I think of how sad the situation is or could be. Africa, again, is the most impacted area by climate change consequences, with the less emission area. We represent less than 5 or 4% of the global emission of greenhouse gases, and we are impacted by things we are not responsible of.
But you're paying the price.
That's why we are here or elsewhere to call about solidarity and the real involvement of developed country to try to correct the consequence of what they did in the past. I am not very optimistic on that, but it is necessary to say how sad it is. Talking about industrial development of Africa, we are hearing more and more sustainability, to respect nature, to try to get net zero stage. For a country which are struggling to get food, to get energy, telling them respect the nature is something bizarre to hear. It's something bizarre to say it. But it is a reality now. That's why I thought the most important thing is development. Sustainability came after, but not at the same time.
You can't take decisions with development, you know, intertwined with sustainability and doing it sustainably as possible.
As a leader, as a prime minister, facing to people who are unemployed, maybe by 60% of them, I have to deliver and to provide service and to provide job. The message about respect nature, protect nature will not be heard because they have a huge problem to solve. This is how it is, why it is very important to talk about the different situation where the countries are and to balance the effort to make within country in order the richest make the hugest efforts. And the country which is struggling for a basic right and the basic needs for their people, they need to be helped. They need the solidarity. It is not possible for them trying to be industrialized and at the same moment, at the same time, respecting the full thing put in on the green agreement discussing in the different COPs. This is a sort of impossibility we have to talk about.
Thank you for sharing that. Prime Minister Papandreou, you also had to take some tough decisions with the Greek fires during your tenure. In fact, I've had the opportunity to cover the Greek fires as a journalist, so I've been, you know, at the coalface of what these fires do to virgin forests. It's devastating. It has a huge impact across the country in Greece. Are you concerned about the policies around climate change right now in Greece right now? And how are you squaring up what's happening? Because, I mean, you're distracted with so many things that you need to focus on the economy. You know, how do you then take the time and create bandwidth to really focus on climate change?
No, absolutely. We've had horrendous fires and floods, and we are also one of the areas in the world which is going to be already impacted, and terrible. And some of the most pristine and virgin areas have been destroyed in Greece and biodiverse. Greece actually has about 60% of the biodiversity of Europe, where very the wildlife, and we're losing that. And I ran on a green agenda when I was elected, actually. But I think what Prime Minister Mara is saying, and I think is very key, to this transition has to be a just transition. We're talking a lot about this in Europe, a green, just transition, a new contract, if you like, an eco-social contract which is just. We cannot put the burden again on people who are feeling pressure, whether it's poverty, whether it's unemployment, whether it's... And there's a lot of money around the world. The question where it is and where it's being used. I remember when I was being pressured by the Troika to put higher taxes on the Greek people, at the same time the banking system was funneling out from the rich to Panama or to Jersey Islands or to I don't know what other tax havens and so on. And I went to President Obama and other leaders and I said, I want you to help so we can fight this global tax evasion, because this is not simply for Greece, this is the whole world. And we are going to have the consequences of huge inequalities. So we need really to deal with this and turn the argument around and say, yes, let's invest in the green development. Let's make it a positive story so that whether it's Africa or Greece, we can show that it is actually helpful for people. Let's say, there's one island in Greece that actually began with the first island where we made it completely green was Stratis, which is next to your island, Limnos, in Greece. And now there's another island, Tilos. A woman mayor did this, and it's completely zero carbon, and it's completely self-sustainable, renewable energy. And what people feel is they feel empowered in many ways. Empowered as citizens, empowered because they have their own power. They are producing their own power, and they have much lower prices. We can actually move to a democratic energy, or we can say, let's have these 5 big super companies from oil, they just take over the renewables, and again, they're extracting money from us rather than we reaping the benefits. So we need to find a different narrative, which is much more equitable, much more democratic, and we'll start with pilot projects, because what Prime Minister Campbell was saying, sometimes we do these, you can't make sweeping changes around the world unless you try new things out. And this is where I think innovation comes in. This is where the cultural world comes in, to bring in new ideas. Let's try this. We have our islands, so I was saying every little island could be a little experiment, and if it works, let's scale it up. But that's where we can really have innovation and creativity. And we need to break from our mindset that there are no choices. There are many choices we can make. And this is where leadership plays an important role. Open up the space. Don't say there's only one way, like the Troika would come, or whoever, or some authoritarian leader, it's my way, or I will ram the solution down your throat. No, open up the space for people to feel safe, to try new ways, and let's learn from each other. Let's learn from different regions. Let's learn interethnic. Let's learn from indigenous peoples who have the experience of living with nature. Let's learn from different generations. Let's learn from women who are more close to the earth historically, but also from our ancient cultures too.
I know, right? I mean, I think there's such a huge disconnect in terms of history, the lessons, and the things we're experiencing today. And the question is, we keep asking, have we learned our lessons? And it feels a lot of the time we haven't learned our lessons, that we're repeating the same mistakes, And, perhaps we're at a precipice. We don't know what will happen to the global monetary system. We don't know what's going to happen with global power access. We're not sure about, who's going to have the big enough voice globally. For example, many African countries just don't have that voice, at least amplified enough. So we're going to wrap now. We've run out of time, sadly. But Prime Minister Finlay, I'm going to give you the last word. I want you to give us 3 things to make us happier.
Yeah.
Tell me. Give us the secrets.
For one, reflect on what it is, what it takes to make an individual, make a community, make a population happy. And we will come, with the answer that it doesn't take much. Yes, what Prime Minister Mara said is very important. Those of us in the developing world and those of us in the leadership role have the responsibility of ensuring that the people are able to go beyond poverty, basic poverty, that they have jobs, that they have income, that they have good health services, that they receive education. But the point is, Bhutan is a poor country, but we have not held back on development. so as to focus on happiness. There can be no happiness if basic needs of human beings are not met. The point is, how do we meet those basic needs in balance with the other needs, the human needs? We have identified, for instance, 9 domains that enable you to find happiness. If you can improve those domains, then you have a chance as a government in enabling the people to find happiness. And
Fantastic.
each of those domains can be measured in terms of how we are progressing. For instance, education,
Yeah.
income, cultural diversity, time use, and things so on like that. So it's balancing needs with demands.
Time. That is it, right? Having more time to live your life. I wish you all an abundance of time, an abundance of happiness. And of course, to our fantastic former Prime Ministers, thank you very much for your insights, for your knowledge, your wisdom, for sharing your personal stories
Thank
with
you,
me.
dear.
Thank you
for
so
being here.
much to you.
Thank you.